Today I'm going to teach you how to ferment sourdough to perfection. When you understand how it works, it's a breeze. Hi, I'm Sune and I'm a food geek. Today I will explain the stages that your dough goes through when it ferments and how you can use this knowledge to your advantage. When it comes to sourdough fermentation, the most critical factors are the amount of starter, the temperature, and time. Other important factors are the flour that you use and rich ingredients. Other factors are humidity and altitude. I'll give you some tips at the end of the video to help you overcome the problems you might be facing under those conditions. To ferment flour into sourdough bread, you will need a starter, which must be active. And what do I mean by active? Well, bubbles are not a sign of an active starter if it doesn't grow. It has to rise after you feed it. How much should it rise and how fast? Well, if you feed it 1 to 1 to 1, meaning 1 part starter, 1 part flour, and 1 part water by weight, it should grow at least double in 3 to about 6 hours when kept at room temperature. If you have a sluggish starter, I recommend that you watch my video with 5 tips for your starter, which will help you get your starter taking off. I mean 3.5 to 4 times growth. If your starter is slow, you cannot ferment the flour, which means that your bread will be flat as a pancake or stiff as a board, depending on how much water's in the dough. The only variables that we need to control to become fermentation masters are temperature and inoculation, which is the amount of starter in your dough. For both these variables, the more or higher it gets, the faster the fermentation will be. That sounds like a good thing, but it can be hard to control the fermentation and stop in time before you over-ferment if it's going too fast. Inoculation is the easier of the 2 variables. The more starter you use, the faster fermentation will go. The less starter you use, the slower the fermentation will go. You can see it as an accelerator pedal. 20% is an excellent place to go if you're fermenting at room temperature. So, before we go on, you need to know 2 essential temperatures. Your starter will go dormant at 4 degrees Celsius, 39 degrees Fahrenheit. That means the dough will stop rising and over-fermentation isn't a factor. Yeast cells will start to die at around 50 degrees Celsius, 120 degrees Fahrenheit. And they'll die completely at around 60 C, 140 F. I've never even tried to ferment at temperatures above 30 C, 86 F, but maybe that would be an interesting experiment. First, let me talk about the stages that a dough goes through. When you mix the starter into the dough, the fermentation starts. What happens is the yeast in the starter will consume the starch molecules in the flour and other carbohydrates that you may have added. There are 2 ways that the fermentation stops again. 1, you bake the bread and the core temperature is above 60 degrees Celsius, 140 degrees Fahrenheit. 2, after the yeast consumes all of the carbohydrates in the dough will have no rising power left. We can divide fermentation into 3 stages. The first one is the buildup, the second is the rise, and the third one is the deflation. The secret to fermentation success is to catch the dough at the right time during the rising stage. If we draw a graph of the growth of the dough over time, it will look something like this. If we then mark where the different stages of the fermentation happen, the buildup starts right after we mix the dough and runs until the dough starts rising. The yeast will be feasting on the carbohydrates in the flour and multiplying. In the process, they create CO2 that will generate a rise. Depending on how much starter you mixed in and ambient temperature, this can take a long time. If you bake at this point, different things can happen. If you bake early in this stage, not enough yeast will be present and you will probably get a pancake. If you bake late in this stage, you might get a fool's crumb or 1 or more giant holes under the top crust. It's pretty unpredictable. There will be too much rising power in the dough at this point. Once enough yeast cells are present, they will produce so much CO2 that the dough will start growing visibly. And that's where the rising stage starts. During this stage, you want to shape the dough and finish fermentation on the counter or in the fridge. The signs of a well-fermented dough are large bubbles on the top, a visibly risen dough, and if you jiggle the container, the dough will seem pretty light. If you let this process continue, the yeast cells will keep consuming carbohydrates until there are none left in the dough. The deflation will set in. While it might take a while for the dough to deflate completely, the rising power of the dough is gone. And even if you try to bake now, all you will get is that dreaded pancake. You can still bake with a dough like this, but put it in a tin. It'll give the dough some height, but it'll have a very tight crumb. Better than throwing it out though. We can use temperature to our advantage. I often put my dough in my proofer at 30 degrees Celsius, 86 degrees Fahrenheit. It will speed up the bulk fermentation, but your entire dough will be pretty warm. Depending on the size of the dough, it can take 30 minutes to several hours before the whole dough is down to room temperature. Of course, it'll slow fermentation as the temperature drops, but a lot of fermentation will occur until that happens. The time your dough stays on the counter will also contribute to the fermentation. So whatever time you use for shaping or final proofing should be added to the total amount of fermentation. And if you do a fridge retard, fermentation will continue until you've cooled the entire dough down to 4 degrees Celsius, 39 degrees Fahrenheit. And let's consider if your fridge is a bit on the warmer side, say 6 degrees Celsius, 43 degrees Fahrenheit, the dough will continue to ferment until you bake it. Yes, at a much slower pace, but given enough time, it will over-ferment. I estimate that the total growth is probably 50 to 100% range for bread to be perfectly fermented. Note that you should take the term perfect carefully because it depends on what you're trying to achieve. If you want a lot of oven spring, you should go for a shorter fermentation, but if you want to bake a tin loaf that doesn't break the crust, you want to go for a longer fermentation, tempering the rise while baking. So, given that the dough will continue to ferment after bulk, we should be careful with going for a 50 to 100% rise during bulk. This is why I recommend stopping bulk at 25% in my master recipe. The remainder of the rise will happen during the shaping and while the dough is cooling down. If you're not using a proofer and your room temperature is lower, you can probably let it grow to 50% before stopping bulk. Now you can see how much goes into making a recipe that fits everybody's kitchen and environment. The starter strength is also a factor. If it's weaker, the numbers will probably be lower, maybe 15 to 20%. And if you have a potent starter, you might be under fermenting at 25%. You could also bulk at a cooler temperature for a longer bulk. But if you put it in a regular fridge, it might take a very long time or not happen at all. So maybe use a wine refrigerator if you want to play around with that. In this case, I wouldn't use less starter, perhaps I'd use more, up to 30%. If you're new to this channel, I bake a lot of sourdough bread and I make delicious food from all over the world. If you want to see more of this content, please join me by subscribing and ringing the bell so you won't miss any future videos. I wouldn't buy anything with Velcro, it's a total ripoff. The retard is another way to stretch out the fermentation time. The reason you want to do this is for the convenience of being able to pick when you bake, but the flavor of the bread will also develop during this time, including the sourness. People often ask me if I bake straight from the fridge or let the dough rise to temperature. I designed my method so that it will have fermented enough once you take it out of the refrigerator. I choose to do it this way because when I want to bake, not wait a few more hours. Plus, scoring fridge cold dough is 130% easier. That's an exact number. Are you fermenting your dough wrong? You tell me. At least now you know how to do it right. Earlier I promised you some tips for baking at high humidity and altitude. Baking at high humidity is pretty cut and dry. Lower the inoculation and the hydration. That way you can stretch out the fermentation so that you won't overproof the dough by accident. Baking time and temperature should be unaffected. Baking at high altitude, it's more complicated. The first thing is to lower the inoculation because the dough will ferment faster. Lower the hydration base the dough on the feeling instead of using all of the water. You should generally ferment shorter and bake hotter. It's hard for me to put specific numbers on this because I can't experiment with this unless somebody sponsors a trip to a mountain for me. If you still have questions about fermentation, put them in the comments and I will try to answer as many as possible. Also, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. It really helps the channel grow and shows the algorithm and me that you care. I hope you learned something today. See you next time.